professional speakers today, one of the things that we have to engage with is the fact that the diversity in our audience is not just around gender or race or kind of physical ability. Age is increasingly one of the diversity dynamics that we have to be able to engage with and connect with while we're speaking. And so from a Tomorrow Today perspective, this is probably the space that's made our organization famous in South Africa. So we started out with Graham probably almost 15 years ago, I think, getting going with the Mind the Gap generational theory stuff. And my focus in particular has really begun to develop around looking at people under 35. And so a little bit of what I'm going to be focusing on today is helping us to get a sense of what are some of the differences, what are some of the things that we need to bear in mind for these younger men and women in our audience who don't necessarily see the world the same way as we do. But to kick off, I just want to give it a little bit of context. So what we have is older members of our audience, so people who grew up in the industrial era, so the silent generation, largely growing up in the 1940s and 1930s and 1940s. And from a communication perspective, these men and women grew up very much in a kind of command and direct world. So they were told what to do. And that's the way they function. They lived in a world where communication was about being given orders and responding to orders. So from a professional speaker's perspective, when we have these generally quite old members in our audiences, they don't need us to do a lot of convincing necessarily. If they buy into us as experts in our field, they will generally take what we say as the truth or as fact right up front, because that's the way that they're used to engaging with authorities. Authorities give orders, authorities communicate in that way, and you're just going to do what you're told. And if we understand the world that they were growing up in and that they developed in, we can understand that that would be the way that they would respond. But the generation that followed them, the baby boomers, grew up through the 1950s and 1960s, and that was the beginning of our transition out of the industrial era and the industrial world, which is very realistic and very about gears and machines and steam and that type of stuff, into a world that began to be about computers, about technology. So in 1948, we had the very first digital computer, a computer called ENIAC, that came out. And the baby boomers who grew up then through this era of growing and developing technology grew up in a world where essentially for them, there was a whole different way of engaging with from a communication perspective and engaging with the world around them. So, you had an interesting interesting image. Scientists from the RAND Corporation in 1954 were asked to imagine what a home computer would look like in 2004, which was 50 years ahead of that. And this is the home computer that they came up with. But the problem that they had is they said this is what a home computer would look like in 2004, but they really didn't think that it would be economically viable for people to have computers in their homes. Probably because when you look at the size of the computer, you'd need a whole new room in your home to get the computer in. And again, as I look at it, everything looks familiar from where we are today, except maybe the steering wheel, unless that's the mouse, turn left, turn right, and double click with the hooter. But the baby boomers grew up in this world. And so for the first time, from a communication perspective, it wasn't this command control, be directed, but it really began to be about pooling together. And what is the collective together? So baby boomers are the architects of the meeting culture that we have in the corporate world today. Because while baby boomers were growing up, there weren't enough resources. So you'd have 3 desks or 6 baby boomers around the 4 desks sharing 3 textbooks. And so as they were growing up, the way that they learned to achieve tasks and get stuff done was to share and to work together. And so as they then moved into the workplace, they brought that with them. And so we have this meeting culture where when baby boomers want to get something done, they call a meeting. And at the end of the day, a baby boomer will head home and say, oh, I had an awesome day. I achieved so much because I had so many amazingly productive meetings. The younger men and women in the organization have a very different perspective. They go home and they're pulling out their hair and they're saying, I didn't get any work done today because I spent all my time sitting in freaking meetings. So from a communication perspective, and that what we as professional speakers need to be aware of is baby boomers really enjoy the collective wisdom that is there when they're able to share and pool their insights with the rest of the people in the room. And so they do like to get engaged. And so from a professional speaker perspective, it's very important that we bring them in and we connect with them and engage them. Generation X's grew up in the world with the information age. So we grew up in the kind of the Google economy where it began to be about, first of all, individuality. So Gen X's are not the community meeting focused people that the baby boomers were. Gen X's are much more focused on sorting out problems themselves. So if from a speaker's perspective, we need to be able to identify and to connect with them as individuals, not as a group, not as a collective. They want to feel engaged with and appreciated for the unique value that they bring in. And from an information age perspective, they're also the first generation who was exposed to more information than any other generation has ever been exposed to before. So for older generations, if they wanted information, they would have to go to the library and go through the catalog cards, find the one book on a topic that maybe existed, and then go to the stacks and hope that the book had been properly filed and stored on the shelves. And that would be the only information that they'd have. But Generation X's, we grew up in that world. That was our childhood experience. But then Google came along and the internet came along, and we began to experience the benefit of information and being able to find lots of information. So very, very different to the silent generation. For the silent generation, if you stand up and you've been introduced as an expert, they will take your word as truth. For Generation X's, just the fact that you've been introduced as an expert doesn't necessarily mean that they'll believe you. So Generation X's, the information and the way that you connect with them and authenticate yourself is very important. And so then we get to where we're at today. We get to the world of the millennials, of the digital natives, growing up a world of technology, increasingly mobile technology. And this has shifted and changed their view of normal. And so I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about these guys, these men and women right now, because that's what we're going to focus on a little bit just now. But as we look forward, one of the things that we need to then consider is what is the world that the next generation of young men and women are being born into? And it's a world that is being influenced by these types of things. Augmented and virtual reality are getting rid of screens. They're changing the way that we engage with data. So for most of us in this room, we started out using computers where you had to use a mouse and a keyboard, and you had to kind of read through the screen, type your stuff, and that was the way that you engaged with things. Today's millennials and the Generation Zs who are following them are growing up in a world where we actually no longer use keyboards. They're the iTouch generation. If you can recognize a picture and you can touch a screen, you can use a computer. What virtual and augmented reality are doing is they're actually beginning to create a space where virtual reality is immersing us into the data, and augmented reality is layering the data over our real world. Then at the back end, we've got the power of AI, of artificial intelligence. We've got the power of quantum computing coming through that's changing what is happening on the back end, and the type of responsiveness and the type of interaction and engagement that this generation being born today is going to expect from the world. And just to give you one really interesting bit of info, in December this last year, so this is around the artificial intelligence stuff, Carnegie Mellon University launched or ran a test with an AI called Libratus. And Libratus was created to play poker. And so for the first 20 days of January 2017, Lebratus played 120,000 hands of poker against 4 top professional poker players. At the end of the 20 days, Lebratus was $1.7 million ahead of the 4 professionals against whom it was playing. I mean, that on its own is pretty amazing. But here's the bit that blew my mind. They interviewed one of the guys who's part of the team that put Lebratus together. And here's what he said about the AI. He said, you cannot win at the game of poker unless you know how to bluff. And so moving into this year, for the first time in history, we have got a computer program that was able to bluff better than 4 of the world's top professional bluffers. And so this is the world that the new audience is going to be growing up and developing into. So that once we've come to terms with the millennials and the Gen Zs around, who are around right now, we can't sit in our laurels and rest. We need to realize that this is a continually developing and a continually evolving challenge and task that we have to set ourselves as professional speakers to be continually relevant and continue to understand how the world around us is forming the view of normal that our audience is going to respond to and respond to most effectively. So that's the context for this multi-generational audience that we have to connect with. But if we consider that probably most of us know ourselves and probably a little bit more comfortable with our parents, we're going to drill down now into the younger generation, into the millennials. So the millennials, initially the research started out, they were called the Generation Y. And if you want to know why they were called Generation Y, all you have to do is have a look at the clothes that they wear. But Generation Y were born in a time where the things that dominated and influenced the development of their value system and worldview were things like the rise of the internet, where the internet went from being something that just academics would use to something that really shifted and changed the whole world. Under the continual shadow of 9/11 and global terrorism and the dynamics of the global village. So there really are global. One of the things is the way that they're able to connect with content and connect with information, and that it happens instantaneously and pushed to them wherever they are with mobile devices in their pockets. And so they really are the first generation where mobile is the default expectation of what they do. And in 2001, a researcher called Mark Prensky coined a term. He said the young men and women growing up in that era, who at that stage he was part of the teaching world. He said these young men and women are digital natives. They've grown up in a world where digital is normal and the absence of digital is abnormal. And so what happens is they haven't had to learn how to use digital technology. So older generations, Generation X's, some of the younger baby boomers, we're able to use tech effectively, which is why we're able to have the webinar the way that we are today. But digital natives, for them, this isn't unusual. This isn't something where where digital natives are being reminded, okay, guys, please remember to mute, having to get spoken through all of the different controls and stuff on the screen, because they just get it intuitively. It's part of their native. But those of us who are older, we've had to learn how to use it. And so Prensky said, digital natives share the world with digital immigrants. And digital immigrants know how to use tech, but we always use it with a bit of an accent. So it's like if I were to move to Paris and go and live in Paris for 10 years and immerse myself in French culture. In 10 years' time, a native French person or a native Parisian would come and talk to me, and in 10 seconds, that individual would know that I was an immigrant. Because no matter how much I knew about know about the culture, I'll still speak French with an accent. And that's who we are as digital immigrants. We can use the tech, but we use it with an accent. So this is that sense of normal, which is one of the major diverging points between people under 35 and those over 35 within our audience, is the way in which we engage with digital technology as part of our everyday lives and the stuff that is just naturally and intuitively comfortable for us. And if you want to know if you're a digital native or a digital immigrant, probably the easiest way to formulate that is to think about your experience that you have in South Africa probably every 2 years, when most of us get our new cell phone. So you head off and you get your box with your new cell phone, you sign all the paperwork for the contract, and you get home, open up the box, take out your cell phone, take out your headphones, the charger, maybe any other peripherals that they've given you. And at the bottom of the box is normally a little bit of a cardboard spacer. You pull that spacer out, look in the box, and there's no freaking manual. And so you get your old phone and your new phone, and you're trying to figure out how to get your content and information across, and you just can't get it there. You just can't get it across. There's no logical way to do it. And so what do? We call our tamest 10-year-old, and we say, come here, my boy, come here, my girl, take these two phones, and I'm going to go and make myself a cup of coffee, and you fix it. And we head off, make a cup of coffee. 10 minutes later, we come back, and our kids hand us our new phone, and everything's across. The contacts, our apps, our emails, everything's in place. And with an astounded look, we look at our kids and say, how'd you do that? Did you go online? Did you find a manual? Were able to download something? And our digital native children just look at us and say, no, I just figured it out. And so that's the difference between digital immigrants and digital natives. We get stuck, they just figure it out. And then Prentice said that the world is also shared lastly with digital dinosaurs. These are men and women who just don't get it. And so when we start talking digital technology, when we start asking them to do certain things in the room, if we have a number of older generation members in our audience, they actually get quite intimidated by us asking them to use technology to engage with us. Now, there are always exceptions. There's always the 70-year-old person who is a brilliant user of Skype and is able to WhatsApp their grandkids all the time. So there are those exceptions. But again, these are men and women who have had to learn how to use it rather than it being natively comfortable to them. But this is the digital landscape. This is the space, some of the diversity and different views of normal that sit within our audience. So one of the things that has influenced the way that the millennials view normal as a result of growing up as these digital natives is the influence of computer games. So just to give you a story, my two children, my son's 13 and a half, my daughter is 10. A while ago, I was working in the garden, and the kids came out and they were a little bit bored, and they started to join me gardening. And after about 10 minutes, that got boring as well. And so they started to pick up the branches that I'd been cutting, and they started running around the garden, shooting at each other. Bang, bang, you're dead. Now, I don't know what it was like for you when you were growing up, but with myself and my sisters, those games always ended in arguments. Because it would be, no, you didn't hit me, you didn't shoot me, I dived and I rolled and it missed me and it hit the wall and I shot back at you and you're dead. And the arguments would just ensue. Now, for my children, they had no problem dying. It was, they would go, bang, you're dead. They argued about the respawn points. No, you can't respawn there because that's too close to my place. And what they had done, I realized amazingly, is my children had taken their gaming reality and they had brought it into real life. And so that's this thing that we experience around computer games or around games. Society has always used games to teach children the skills they need to be successful adults. So when you're playing a game of peekaboo, your 2-year-old is learning something. Even though I can't see dad, doesn't mean dad's not there. As children grow up, they'll then migrate to start playing something like hide and seek. And they're learning an extension of the peekaboo lesson. And the extension is, even though dad can't see me, it doesn't mean I'm not safe. And then for older generations, as they grew into adolescence and young adulthood, they started to play board games. And whatever the board games were that you played in your family, You learned adult life skills through the board games that you played. Now, young millennials today may still play board games, but it's an event. It's something that they'll play every now and then, and it's a big thing. It's not just their normal way of doing relaxation and chilling. Today's young people, when they graduated from hide and seek and those things into adolescence, they didn't move to a world of board games, they moved to a world of computer games. And so what computer games have done is computer games have taught different things, and computer games have taught differently. And so as we connect with our audience, this is some of the stuff we need to realize. And so just very simply, think about failure as a concept, as an idea. When you played board games, what did board games teach you about failure? Think about Monopoly. If you lose all of your money and your houses and your property and everything, and you're out of the game. Is there any way to get back in? No, there isn't. If you're the first person out and people trust you, maybe you can be the coffee jockey, bringing coffee to everybody else. Maybe you can be the banker, or else you're just sitting as a spectator watching the game. What did you learn about failure there? If you fail, you're dead. But when you play a computer game, what happens? You come around a corner and you do something wrong and you die, and then you get exactly what my children engage with. You get that argument. You're not dead. It's not the game over. You respawn. You go to the last point in the game that you saved, to the last threshold you crossed, and you come to that same point where you died before, and you just try something different. And as you try something different, you may die again. It doesn't matter. You go back, you respawn again. And you can come over that same point 10, 20, 30, 50 times. But eventually you're going to come around past that point and you're going to succeed and you're going to get it right. And as a result of that, you're going to move on and you're going to next level. If you ever come back and play this level again, when you get to this point that you died 50 times, are you going to try any of the 50 things that didn't work? Or are you going to do the one thing that did work? What have we learned about failure through playing computer games? It's not that failure is death. It's that failure is part of the process of eventually getting it right. Two very different perspectives of the same thing as a result of the different types of games that our digital natives, our millennials, have played as opposed to older generations. And so two gents wrote a book called Got Game, How the Gamer Generation is Changing Business Forever. Howard Beck and Mitchell Wade are the name of the authors. And they identified 6 values that computer gaming generated in this generation. The first thing they said, they're very social. So even though a gamer might look like they're sitting in the lounge on their own, they're not generally playing on their own. They're part of a virtual community that they're part of. They're very flexible. So they'll go and they'll have an objective, they'll have a strategy, but they'll chop and change that strategy as they need to in order to achieve their task. Because linking to number 4, they're very competitive. They want to win. And so they'll do whatever they need to win. They're able to multitask. A study at the University of Toronto looked at brain activity and identified that computer gaming develops the same level of mental agility as learning multiple languages. They're also very arrogant. And Beck and Wade said, but you would be arrogant as well if you saved the world every day. And then finally, they're insubordinate. And this insubordination is just because of the traditional views of leadership that are coming through and the traditional views of authority that older generations have carried with them. So for older generations, the leader and the boss was the authority. And he said, this is what goes and this is what happens. For the gamer generation, for millennials, the way leadership works in the online community is that the role of the guild master or the team leader is not to lead us on every task, is not to be the authority on everything, but to find the right person within our team to lead us on this task so that we're successful. And all of this is driven by that underlying value of being competitive and of wanting to win. So if the leader didn't do that, if the leader insisted on leading every single task, after a while, their team would abandon them. Because they basically say, we're not winning because you're not putting the right people in to lead us in those tasks. And so what happens is older generations look at this from a millennial's perspective and say, you're insubordinate, you lack respect, The reality is that it's actually just a different view of leadership and of the benefits and the place and the engagement that we have with authority. And so for us as professional speakers, you often stand up and rely very much on the fact that we're viewed as authorities, that we're viewed as leaders when we stand up and we speak. We need to understand that from the millennial perspective, they're not seeing that credibility or that perspective that we bring of ourselves in the same way as the older men and women in our audience are. Then there's it's something that kicks in around about 28, and it's called the quarter life crisis. Older generations, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, older generations, as we led the world, took care of a lot of the basic needs. So the silent generation post-World War II, post the Great Depression, they really rebuilt the world. And so the psychological needs, the needs of safety and security, those are taken care of by the silent generation. The baby boomers focused a lot on building a social world. Generation X's were essentially individualists, so very much about self-esteem. What have we left for the digital natives and the millennials? The top of the pyramid. Self-actualization. So as digital natives and millennials move into adulthood, they're moving into a world where all of the lower needs are already taken care of for them. They've been taken care of and they've been made aware of them as they were growing up as children. So the questions that they're beginning to ask themselves in adulthood are the questions of self-actualization. And so in their late 20s, for the first time in their lives, they're lifting their heads up, looking around at the people that they work with, looking at their parents, looking at family, looking at the other grown-ups in their lives, and they're asking the question, is this who I want to be? And as digital natives in the process, they're also redefining Maslow's hierarchy. Is this who is a question that older generations that we asked when we hit our 40s and our mid-40s, and we had a midlife crisis. The millennials are having that crisis a decade and a half earlier, at 28, 29, 30. And so what we're starting to see is young men and women who have worked hard and have qualified in the professions that their parents were very proud of them entering. So we're seeing a motor mechanic, or not a motor mechanic, an engineer resigning and heading off and becoming a chef. A CA is leaving to chase their dreams of being a motor mechanic. We're seeing young men and women just making decisions at the stage of life where we were hoping that they'd become grown up and that they'd start maturing, and they're making decisions that are making the older generations look at them and say, these kids are flakes. And what's actually happening is they're not flakes. They're experiencing a life stage that is absolutely unique to them. Never existed before, and it's changing their whole view of normal. So when you stand up, and the other interesting thing is that a lot of millennials don't even know that everybody else is going through this. When I stand up and I speak about the quarter life crisis, inevitably somebody in the audience who's in their late 20s will come up to me afterwards and say, wow, I didn't realize that I was normal. I thought that was a weird, abnormal thing that I was going through, and I didn't know that it had a name. In fact, it happened at the National Convention. One or two of the younger members came up to me afterwards and said, gee, so this is why I want to be a professional speaker. I'm coming out of my quarter life crisis, and this is where my passions lie. And my parents are telling me that I'm crazy, but this is what I want to do. And so as you have these young men and women in your audience, understand that they look at the world differently, and the way they hear your message, the lens through which they view it, the filters through which they hear it, are the filters of a quarter life crisis where they're asking the questions of self-actualization. And it's never happened before, and they are not flaky, they are not freaky, they are normal. So if you want to connect effectively with the millennial men and women, the millennial members of your audience, have a look at them and ask, what are they thinking? How do their brains work differently to ours? What are they doing? Where are they engaging? What are they making? What's the stuff that gets their creative juices going? Where are they going? Where are they forming community and culture? What is the stuff that sits at their gut? But ultimately, in light of all the stuff some of the stuff I've said tonight, you've got to ask yourself, what is it that they believe that's different to what I believe, or to the assumptions that I would generally be very comfortably able to make? Where are our beliefs slightly different? And how can I bridge that gap in connecting with them at that point in their heart? And as we then connect with the millennials, the next generation coming through, our children today, the Generation Zs, are also coming through, and they're being influenced very differently with a whole lot of different things coming through. The internet, mobile phones again. But for them, the internet is very different. It's not just about and access data. It is about broadband. So they don't know the horror of and then waiting for a web page to load for 10 minutes that many of us experience through dial-up. For them, if something doesn't happen instantaneously, they're going to move on. And this is probably the most instant gratification generation that has ever lived, the Generation Zs. We don't know exactly all the influences that are forming their value systems, so that's why they're called the Zs at the moment. We haven't got a new label for them yet, but the labels that are being bandied about, are they being called either the selfie generation or potentially the I-touch generation? The first generation of young men and women who haven't had to know how to read or type to use a computer. So this is the next phase of our audience that we're going to be connecting into. And to wrap up, I just want to give you just an illustration for the way to connect with your audience. And it comes from sheep farming. Now, when we drive through the Karoo, through a world-famous sheep farm on the end, or sheep area on the end farms where the sheep farmers have strung up fences. And the fences are there for a reason. They're there to help the sheep farmer manage his resources, his flock, his grazing, his water resources. But what ends up happening for many of those farmers in the Karoo, they're stringing up hundreds of kilometers of fences. And it ends up being one of their biggest capital expenses on their farm. And so unintentionally, many of the farmers in the Karoo end up spending more time managing their fences than they do managing their sheep. In the Aussie outback, which is also for its sheep, the ranches in the outback, which is also a semi-desert, much like the Karoo, don't have fences. What the Aussie sheep ranchers do is they sink wells. Because what they know about their sheep is that in a desert environment, every single animal knows that there's only so far that you can wander away from a source of water before you have to turn around to get back when you're thirsty. And so rather than trying to manage their sheep by putting fences that try and corral them in, the sheep ranchers sink a well that causes the sheep to actually stay where they are out of their own self-interest. And so in a very real sense, this is what we need to be doing as professional speakers. Not asking, how do I hem my audience in? What are some of the boundaries and parameters that I can put in place to keep them focused in the space where I want them to be? As you connect with a very diverse, multi-generational audience, as you start connecting with millennials who look at the world differently to the way that you do, you've got to ask yourself, where are my wells? What are the wells in my message that while I'm speaking, I can sink them in the middle of the room, and the millennials and this audience that I don't necessarily see the world in the same way as I do will choose to stay and engage with me and with my content because they see that it is in their best interest to be here. And so what we have to wrap up is we have this dynamic. If you look on the page there or on the screen, there are two things. There's a pile of rubbish or of trash on the left-hand side and a picture of an older gentleman, a portrait on the right-hand side. And if you look at it right like that on the screen, it looks like there's nothing that those two things have in common. But if you look at the GIF, the animation that's happening on the bottom of the screen now, what you can see is that actually those two things are exactly the same. The only difference is the perspective from which you're viewing the content on the floor. And so what we have with connecting with the millennials, with young men and women who look at the world differently to us, is we need to realize that there is no right or wrong in any of this interaction. What we have is we just have a whole lot of different ways to engage effectively with the different perspectives and say, where are you seeing it from? Why and how is your perspective different to mine? And how can we unlock the value of actually seeing things different, but able to connect with nonetheless? My contact details are there. My contact details are there. Obviously, everything's being recorded. I'll send the slides through to Charlotte.